All right, welcome to the Lovecraft Easing podcast. Today we have Paul Tremblay. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Mike. Hey,
Hey,
John. Hey, Laird.
yes,
Hey,
John Langan, Laird, Barron, they're both here. Hey, guys.
Hey,
hello.
Cisco's supposed to be here, but maybe he's, as I said before we recorded, still sleeping off StokerCon.
it would
Yeah.
not surprise me.
You were at StokerCon also, right, Paul?
Yes, I mean, it is
Looked like a
Sunday,
lot of
so I
fun.
think it was. But I think Michael tends to go to like a 4 hour long mass, so maybe he's not back yet.
Well, it's the
Really?
Black
No.
Mass,
Right.
of course, the Mass Noir, as we call it. Yeah,
Uh,
he hasn't apparated back from that yeah, stepped out of an angle.
Well, thanks everybody for watching and listening. Thanks to all my patrons especially. And let's see. Paul has a book coming out. I left it in the living room.
oh, this fell out. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, ow, yeah.
Wow.
The Beast You Are
Wow.
by Paul Tremblay. And it comes out July 11th, right?
Correct.
Right. So, yeah. Why don't we interrogate Paul about this? Yeah.
We already used up all our jokes before we started recording. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we can't be funny for the rest of the broadcast. So, okay. So I want to tell you why my wife is a little miffed at you. So,
Me?
yeah, you.
Oh.
So, so she's doing a AP class for the AP students this year
Mhm.
with teachers from all over the nation at TCU for the next 4 days. And she's like, Paul Tremblay, that's one of your friends, right? And I was like, yeah. I said, why? And she said, because they suggested that we teach one of his books, A Head Full of Ghosts.
Nice.
Yeah, I said, oh, that's cool. I'll have to tell Paul that. Then she's reading the bio they have on you, and she's like, what the hell? He's a math teacher? I was like, yeah. She has this thing about math. It's
Mm.
evil. Math teachers are evil. So
Wow.
She's not wrong.
it's not that bad, but yeah, she's like, I can't believe I'm going to teach Paul Tremblay and he's a math teacher. So
Well, that's usually the response the math gets. So, she's certainly not alone in that visceral reaction of anti-math.
well, I think the choice which was between that and I can't remember what it was, but something that's
The Fisher guy.
yeah,
The
no,
Fisher.
even older than that.
Wow.
It wasn't Frankenstein, but it was something equally.
Mm.
Man, no, I know what it was. It was The Haunting of Hill House. Now, I love that story. She's like, so should I teach The Haunting of Hill House or Head Full of Ghosts? I was like, well, Head Full of Ghosts, no question. It's, you know, we want to teach kids that it's fun to read, and that book's really accessible. She goes, well, you don't like Haunting of Hill House? And I'm like, no, I like it, but I'm old. I'm not sure if the kids will like it as much as they would Head Full of Ghosts. So that's my thought anyway.
Oh, well, thank you. No, I mean, and obviously Haunting of Hill House should be taught. So I'm torn
Angry
between.
emails from Shirley Jackson fans in three,
Yeah.
two, one.
So anyway, yeah, that's what's going on with Danielle. So I may be contacting you about that.
Okay. Well, I wish her luck if that's the case, and I wish her no math, or as they say in the UK, maths with an S.
Maths.
That cracks me up.
So
Can you tell?
July 11th, The Beast You Are comes out.
Yeah.
And there's an audiobook too. Who's reading that?
They have a whole bunch of readers, which is really cool. Almost like for every story.
Oh, that is
But
cool.
I do know one of the readers that's going to repeat throughout is Joy Osmansky, who did A Head Full of Ghosts, actually. And she's wonderful.
Different readers for different stories. That's Stephen King cool. He does that in his audiobooks. So
yeah, no, very, very lucky, that they wanted to sort of go that route. They don't let me read,
well,
which is probably wise.
thank you for sending me the book. But I was going to say I'm also probably going to spend a credit on the audiobook when it comes out, because as I was reading, especially I would say, and it just worked out this way, but especially the first 3 or 4 stories, I thought were just creepy as hell. I mean, I enjoyed all of them, but as I was reading them, I thought, how cool would it be to be laying in bed in the dark and listening to this particular story. The first one being the very first story, haunted house tour, one per person, with ice cold lemonade, 25 cents struck through. So, how did that story come about? I mean, I read your story notes, but
Oh.
the audience presumably hasn't yet.
Well, thanks.
Nor,
Well,
nor will they.
nor will
What's
they,
that?
nor should they.
Nor will they.
Yeah. Well,
No,
you
they're
know,
like, if I read the story notes, do I have to read the book?
I see you've been in my classroom.
right. Well, so like, I mean, I guess part of the story started with the actual title. And it probably started with my daughter Emma at the time, wanting to set up like a lemonade stand like every other day. So from like the point of view of a parent, it's like, oh yeah, that's fun, but also like what weirdos are going to show up? You always worry,
Right.
is John and Laird going to show up? Which they never did. So I don't know, like it was with, and I think she was thinking of trying to sell some other stuff too. So I don't know, just sort of like one of those weird things that hit you was like, oh, what if, she was on, instead of lemonade because it wasn't selling, like she wanted to sell like tours of the house, of a haunted house. So I had the idea, just that like very nascent sort of thing kicking around for a bit, but I hadn't really done much with it. And then Ellen Datlow came calling, as she does sometimes for short stories. And you can't say no to Ellen.
No.
And she was compiling this giant, amazing ghost anthology called Echoes. It's like 800 pages.
Yeah. It's a
Um,
doorstop.
yeah. John has a story in there. Laird, do you have one in there? Or is that one of the few that you don't? A few of Ellen's?
I missed three invites, and that was one I'm really regret. I was working on the Coleridge series.
Yeah.
But no, those are great story and great. I mean, that was a great anthology to be in.
Yeah.
And John
thank you.
does have a giant story in there.
It's actually
long
half
is
half the anthology.
How long is the beast? The beast you are. That's how long is that?
The
What's
whole
your-
book?
I'm sorry. The
novella?
Yeah, the novella. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So it's about like 30,000 words.
Right.
Yeah. So it's like 1/3 of the book, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the haunted house story is about like 10,000 words. So I don't know. So it was sort of fun writing. It's, looking back on it, it was a little bit of a warm up for the Pallbearers Club because it uses sort of the teen version of me that, I spend much more time with in the Pallbearers Club, in the haunted house story. No, but thank you. I'm glad you found it creepy.
Well, the narrator's name is Paul.
Yes, this is true. Thinly veiled.
Right.
One of my favorite stories about writing that story, though, really, really briefly, because I'm sure John and Laird and Mike too, you all been asked, oh, have you ever scare yourself, or have you ever like seen a ghost? And my answer to both is no. I typically, I don't scare myself in writing. I'm too close to it, and I never know if something's scary. But anyway, when I was writing the final scene of the haunted house story, where minor spoiler, like the character who's me hears like a noise upstairs, and it's building towards this conclusion.
Right.
I was finishing the draft on a nice hot sunny summer day like this, and I was home alone with my dog Holly, who's hiding from me currently because she knows I'd probably grab her and show her to the camera. But as I was writing that scene, the exact moment I was writing the sentence about this large noise happening upstairs, there was a big like crash from upstairs.
Oh, you're kidding. Wow.
Yeah, and I had all like the physical horror stereotypes of I've never had that experience much of like the hair standing up on the back of your head, and totally freaked out. Like I said, I was alone, so I grabbed the baseball bat and Holly. I don't know which weapon was going to be stronger. If this was a D&D game, like Holly could be my little homunculus that I could throw at the ghost or the intruder. But we went up, and there was no ghost or anything upstairs that I could see, but like a shampoo ball had fallen in the bathroom, in like the kids' bathroom. Don't know why it fell. Like the windows, I think, were pretty much closed at that point. But yeah, anyway, so that story had a real life scare for me.
Well, first of all, thanks for being kind. I've got 2 short stories published as of yet, but working on it. Yeah. But you said in another interview, and I actually copied it, as a reader, I connect more with personal stories. I was thinking exactly the same thing as I was reading several of these, this one included. So I don't want to spoil anything. The book is yet to come out, but it begins with the guy's in his house alone. His mom has been over. His wife and his daughter are out of town for until the next day, and his mom has come over and left a box of his stuff that he, had when he was a kid. He grew up in the 80s, as most of us did, and there's a picture in there that he missed. He only catches on his a drawing on his second go through in the box, and you actually include it. It's actually pretty creepy looking, first of all. But here's what really grabbed me with this story. If you don't mind if I read a couple sentences.
Sure.
The initial discovery was more confounding than dread-inducing, but hours have passed, and now it's late and it's dark. I have every light on in the house, which only makes the dark outside even darker. I am alone, and I am on alert, and I feel time creeping forward. Time doesn't run out, it continues forward, and it continues without you. I do not sit in any one room for longer than 5 minutes. I pass through the lower level of the house as quietly as I can, like an omniscient, emotionally distant narrator, which I am not. And you made it so real. This guy's in his house, and by nothing other than looking at a box of his stuff from a kid and noticing this drawing, he's slowly really creeped out. So, yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess just I was trying to recreate the feeling of like how you could sort of freak yourself out when you're home alone, which I don't know about you guys, but if that's the case, because for me, it's sort of rare to be home by myself now. And I find anytime it happens, I'm not used to it. And that's when the wheels start spinning.
Yeah. Laird, John, you guys have some questions you want to throw at Paul?
Oh, I've got questions.
Oh, where
I
to
bet you
begin?
do.
No, actually, I don't have anything. No.
Okay, well,
Actually, kind of honestly, I sort of wish that that Michael Sisko had joined us, because while I was at StokerCon with my new BFF, on the long ride across Pennsylvania, which I'm sorry is too big.
Long.
My God. Anyway, he just out of nothing, he was talking about, he's obviously read a lot of your writing, and he was talking about like what he sees you doing as a writer, and he was talking about the kind of the sort of meta aspect of it, but the meta without being cheap, I guess you would say. It's just like it's not quite the sort of nudge wink wink, but it's more we're at a point in time where we all know these stories, and to pretend we don't, to imagine we live in a universe where it's like, oh my God, what, a haunted house, who heard of such a thing, so yeah, so if Sisko were here, he would have brilliant things to say about that, but you're just stuck with me. So
I wasn't going to say it, but
yeah, well, it's we were all thinking it. The audience was like, oh my God, stop. But no, I guess there's something kind of fascinating to me in this collection about the way that it starts with the haunted house story, and then it ends with the animal story, with the sort of animal fable. Like, these are like two very old forms of narrative, and I don't want to pivot exactly to the beast you are yet, if we want to talk about other stories first, but I was just thinking,
yeah.
well, I was just thinking about how in the haunted house story, it's occasioned for you by Emma and what she's doing, and it's connected. And of course, when you're a kid, right, like going into the scary house, or the scary place in the neighborhood, that's like such a rite of passage and such a big deal. And in some weird way in my mind, that connects to things like Watership Down, that you read when you're a kid, and your parents like, oh, it's about rabbits, it's fine, maybe they even look at you, aren't you a little old to be reading books about rabbits? And then maybe they watch the movie and they're like, oh my God. So anyway, this is a long, rambly prompt to see what you do with.
Oh, well, thanks. Well, it's funny. Well, thank you first and foremost. Thank you, Michael, in whatever dimension he's existing in right now. It's
Hour
right. Like,
5 of the Black Mass.
like I mentioned to Laird earlier this week when we chatted, I picked up one of the Cormac McCarthy books I haven't read yet, and it's The Crossing. And just this morning I was reading it, and it's the part where the boy who's left home, and the whole thing with the wolf has already happened, but he's listening to this older Mexican man tell this who lives by himself in like this decrepit church, and he's telling a story about this other old man, and within that, like the storyteller acknowledges like, oh, like I know, as I'm butchering what McCarthy wrote, but like it sort of just struck me that the essence of sort of writing was there, like what it is to write or tell a story, because every narrator that starts looks at the person they're telling the story to, and he knows they're thinking, I've heard the story before, but he said all stories are one story, or something to that effect. Like the idea is, yeah, I mean, everything's been told before, but it's just sort of like, how are you going to approach it, or how are you going to bring something different to it? McCarthy, of course, goes way metaphysical with it and relates it to the existence or non-existence of God, which, is amazing. Like reading this book, I'm like, why am I bothering? But anyway, but like, that's sort of like, I don't know, I guess that's the thing, right? Like I'm finding myself more and more, you said, drawn back to like the stories of my childhood now, the older that I'm getting for whatever reason. Not sure why, but that's sort of what's happening.
Laird and I were talking a few weeks ago. We were talking about his new Coleridge book in a previous episode. And Laird, you said something similar. I can't do it justice, but it was about the noir of Coleridge, and that it's been done before, sure, but it's about putting your spin on it.
Oh, right. I've said that all for many years, and it applies to how I feel about my writing, but also what I like about my contemporaries, my colleagues writing, Paul and Cisco at Black Mass, and John, so many people that I really respect in the business. And just a matter of, it's all been done. It has all been done. And readers aren't always craving something so new that it's nerve shatteringly new. They just want a tale that is through your lens, and we all have that lens. It's something unique to us. But it leads me into commenting about Paul's writing in general, especially the fiction, because there's a big difference between the short fiction and the long form, I feel, in Paul's case. Probably if I analyze it closely, most writers, there's probably some sort of difference tonally, but depending on the length of their work. But Paul, for me, it's always been really striking, the difference between your novels and your short fiction, is especially the last 10 years or so. But just speaking to the short fiction, because that's what we're here to talk about, one thing that I've noticed is, this is what your third, is this your third collection? I think what were the first collection was
so I guess it's actually, I guess it's actually my fourth. I had the Prime Books one, Compositions for the Young and Old.
Yeah, that's the first one I read.
Yeah, In the Meantime with Chizine.
Yep.
And then
Growing Things,
and now this.
Sorry.
Although with the more, I will say with the two Moro collections, because In the Meantime's out of print, like with each of the two latter collections, I have sort of stuffed in a couple of stories from In the Meantime. So,
but still four collections, because they each had substantially different stories.
Yeah.
Right. And of course I came, that's how I first encountered your work. I don't know. I can't remember if I read something of yours, maybe online before we met, like Cheesine or something like that. Or Chiaroscuro. I can't remember what it was called. I don't remember if you had something there, but the first book of yours I read was Composition for the Young and Old. In the meantime, I felt there was like this vertical there was this escalation, not only in your ability, but just in the kinds of the way that you attacked subjects, and there was very sharp, and I mean like in a cutting sense. And then obviously there's been a transformation with these latter two collections, the substantially newer work. But one thing I've noticed, And this is, I think, with my favorite authors, is there's an evolution of thinking, of philosophy, and of execution. Like, you can always tell it's the same. I mean, you're still Paul. You know, this is the same writer that I first encountered back in 2005 or whatever, 2004, when I first started reading you. But there has been an evolution, not just in, you know, ability, but also in execution, but in the way that you approach things, and maybe even the topics. And I don't know, maybe I'm misapprehending this, or maybe you could speak to it, but a lot of the stories, even though they are broader, they seem less like in the early collections, there would be a, you know, I could tell that it was like, this is a cool subject, and I'm gonna do, you know, this would be a cool story. These days, I get more of an impression that there's a lot more of you, not to conflate you with the author, with the creation, but I do, they just feel more personal. And could you talk about that?
Well, thank you, Laird. I'm honored. I'm just glad you didn't say, you know, the the differences between the short stories and the novels. These suck, but the novels really suck.
No,
no, I know.
Let me jump in there.
Yeah.
What I mean by different is that there's a more your short fiction is dense. There's some density to it that you know, that I think is different than how you write some of your novels.
No, thank you. I wasn't fishing for another compliment, but thank you. I mean, I do feel like, I mean, these days, you know, so I guess I'll sort of conflate that with the Beast You Are. If I do get short story ideas, they almost feel like little flashes as opposed to something larger, like little personal flashes. And a writer that I know all of us admire deeply, Jeffrey Ford, I love his short stories where he and his wife Lynn are characters. You know, and I don't know, I still like anything I do starts from the fan place. Like, oh, I really love Jeffrey stories like that. You know, I don't want to do exactly that, but I kind of am drawn to, you know, sort of that more personal attachments to stories, you know, even if they end up, you know, going in wild places like Jeffrey's stories do. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it was funny to the point where when I wrote the Pallbearers Club, like so many of these stories were written either right before or right after, you know, because that book ended up being so autobiographical. I was worried that I sort of emptied the bucket, you know, and used all the personal anecdotes and stories for that novel, because I've been, you know, been sprinkling them around here and there. And I've been a little, not worried, but thinking about, you know, sort of what's next, because for so long I sort of relied on my parent experience, you know, teacher experience, you know, as a parent of like younger kids. But now that they're sort of older on their own, it's like, oh, like I don't feel as attached to, you know, say like, you know, the young sisters in A Head Full of Ghosts, or, you know, the young family in The Cabin at the End of the World or something. So, you know, I know that was like an obsession of mine for so long. You know, there's a part of me, it's like, oh no, you know, what are we going to do now? You know, and maybe the easiest thing to say is sort of to take that anxiety and sort of put it to work for you. I don't know.
Well,
The personal.
how about,
Go ahead, Larry. Go ahead.
I don't want to be out of place here, but you have, and maybe even during an interview, we have talked before about life experiences and how everybody has different life experiences. Some are dramatic. Some people go through life and, you know, it's not as dramatic on the surface. And you had spoken to that in the past. Sometimes you'd felt like maybe your life had not been dramatic. And so I kind of got the sense sometimes that, you know, maybe you felt that you had to do a lot of heavy lifting. In other words, you didn't have it to just draw on from something that had happened to you. So you had to go manufacture it. But it feels like I don't know if consciously, but it really does feel to me over the last at least 6-7 years, and this applies to your novels as well, that maybe you had a lot more in the reservoir of personal experience than you realized.
Yeah, no, I thank you. I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think that's the case for all writers. You know, and I have to admit, you know, maybe this happens to all people sort of our age, but I find myself as a reader, I don't know, like, and this is not like across the board, but more drawn to books featuring people our age. I mean, part of it is just, yeah, this is the experience that I'm living now. You know, and I've been thinking about that a lot, like sort of both like Western culture in particular, obsession with youth culture, which has been forever. I mean, especially in terms of entertainment or art or the arts, right? You know, what does that mean as you get older as a writer? And in some ways, it almost seems it almost seems like a little bit unfair. It's like, oh man, I've spent all this time and all this work to get to a point where I feel like I can actually do some cool stuff. But also at the same time, like maybe that cool stuff, doesn't fit with the readership, because the readership stays the same age in a lot of ways, if that makes sense. Or I guess maybe the wider cultural sort of attention span or something. I don't know. I don't even know if I just addressed what was being said or asked. But that's what so yeah, I think by looking further inward, Laird, I did discover, there were all these sort of little dramas that were there that I could sort of pull from, and including like, my dad losing his job, like that's become like a big thing I've sort of mined throughout. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's the advantage of a writer that has actually worked for a while and done things, like you get to pull from all that.
The only thing I would add to that is, and it was just a guess on my part, but or maybe an observation, I suppose, but I have to give John Langan a bunch of credit for that, because well, students have said that, other writers and students and whatnot have said that to you in the past in my presence. I don't think, I'm not sure what I'm going to write about. I haven't, lived enough. If they're young or
Right.
if they're older, I don't have a lot of, super dramatic things. And John has said time and again, your life is far more interesting, especially to somebody else, than you think. And, it's your job as a writer to find that, and, and to carve that out essentially. And I don't know, I feel like you have, but I also feel like it's something that I've observed John say to people and to advise them that don't discount doesn't matter what your past is. Don't discount it. It's,
Lawrence
there's
Block
value.
Lawrence Block
Yeah,
once
I would
said
say really
that-
quickly, sorry.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a better way of putting it. Because obviously there are writers in their 20s who do amazing stuff. I just think, for me, it took me until almost my 40s to have the confidence to think, I do have stuff that's interesting that I could sort of pick from. Whereas, like, I know John and I have talked about this quite frequently. Like when we first read Nadia Bulkin, when her story was published in the Chiaroscuro Tropical Convergence. I'm gonna butcher the title.
Intertropical Convergence Zone.
Yeah. So when we first read that story, it's like, holy crap, she's like in her mid-20s when she published that, and we were like really excited, but also kind of mad. It's like, how did someone so young write this amazing thing? But obviously, at a much younger age than me, Nadia was able to figure out like how to have your own voice and how to use sort of your experience to create the story. Sorry, you were saying Lawrence Block, yeah.
Yeah, he once told me that anyone who has survived through, I'm paraphrasing, survived through childhood into adulthood has stories to tell.
That's right.
Yeah, I also like it's funny because I find myself thinking, okay, on the one hand, there's like this famous quote from Flaubert, all that is required for
Flaubert, that guy owes me money. Sorry.
All that is a fellow Frenchman. But all that is required for something to become interesting is for you to stare at it long enough. And I think that there's some truth to that. But at the same time, I also find myself thinking about, there was an interview recently with Scorsese, and he was like, man, like I feel like I'm getting it. I feel like I'm getting how to make movies and how to do everything I want to do in movies. And I'm an old man, and it was like,
it's too late.
Yeah. And when Kurosawa got his like Lifetime Achievement Award from the Oscars, he said the same thing. He was like, I think I'm finally, he didn't say it's too late, but he just said like, I think I'm finally starting to understand how to do this. And I mean, for Scorsese, it was kind of like a cry of despair. I don't know that for Kurosawa, I thought it was more kind of humble, but I think you're right that like you kind of get to this point where you start to have a sense of what your own capabilities are. And I think you also, I think in a general, sort of generic kind of sense, you also start to realize like, man, these are like, my dad lost a job, man, that does obsess me, and it's weird, right? Because you don't want to, we're all like really leery of like repeating ourselves, I guess, but in the sense maybe of like, we're afraid that like we're not going to be the same old, and we're not going to be doing anything new with those obsessions. But I'll swack the shuttlecock back to Laird now and say that um Laird in essence said to me at one point, just lean into it, like that was his take. I was like, oh my God, I've written all these stories about fishing and I'm not a fisherman at all, but it keeps popping up in my, like, I just suddenly had this like horrifying, and Laird was like, fine, just do it. Every now and again, you write a fish, just be that guy. This, we've talked about this before. I guess this is in a way more for anybody who's watching and is like, yeah, what do I do about that? And it's absolutely true, isn't it, that all our lives are far more interesting than we give them credit for being. We're
Yeah.
just because it's our lives, we can't see it, we're just like, this old thing, and it's like, no, what happened there was crazy. So in terms of like inventing from what yeah, I mean, you had a kid who lived in Texas for a while going to school, right, during COVID. That's a crazy story, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there's a horrifying narrative in there.
Oh yeah, I have one in
tell
my
me
head, but
about it.
I did not write that because I would have been too afraid of it. But yeah.
But
It was funny,
now,
well, I mean, thinking of like Stephen Graham Jones, who, has got this width and breadth of stuff, of different kind of things that he's written. But like when you talk to him, well, first he used to always sign his books to me when I first met him. This one's pure autobiography, and I'm like, really, Stephen, the time traveling camo Pete one. But then I later, like, I sort of understood what he meant. So I mean, there's that. I mean, Stephen's obviously lived an interesting life, just like just about everybody's lived an interesting life. But he has like this, especially like now, like he has this, like, and John, I know you've talked to him about this or seen him talk about it, like this obsession with transgression and justice, like a very sort of slashery sort of view of every, like, he looks at every story through that, like, slasher, someone did something wrong, something bad is going to come to sort of, like, I would say necessarily set things right, because they actually usually go too far.
right, but the sort of
but,
balancing an attempt at balance, right?
yeah, so I mean, it sounds like a very, at a first blush, it's a very simple way to describe sort of a plot arc of a story, right? But then he's written, like, how many books has he written by now?
Too many. Stop it, Stephen.
Yeah,
Stop it.
Yeah, over 20, and that's not counting the comics, etc. But again, to go back to the idea of it's all the same story, but they're all different stories.
It kind of harkens back to me in that, again, going back to that first story, I personally felt, I don't know if you intended it or not, but there's also this, I don't know, subtext of a fear that, the protagonist, he talks about what a loser he was growing up in the 80s, and had no confidence, was skinny and blah, blah, blah. I can relate to that too. But this fear that maybe I haven't changed very much, and am I still that loser or not? I that's kind of another background fear in the first story in the book. At least I read it that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely, for sure. Again, a part of that is being at a certain age where, like, I don't know what age you all were when you learned this, like, the sort of the terrifying lessons, like, oh, there are no adults. You're growing up, you assume, like, oh, my parents, these are the adults in the room and other adults, and you get to a certain age, it's like, holy shit. Nobody knows what the hell they're doing. They're just like me, like, terrified of
very few. Like
existence.
Obama's an
Yeah.
adult. I'm not sure if I can know of anyone else who's an
Yeah.
adult.
No, for sure. I mean, that was played out. Like I said, that's partly why I think, unconsciously, that was like a little bit of a warm up for the Paul Bearers Club, where it's sort of that fear definitely, hangs over Art Barbara through the whole book.
Yeah.
But that's there.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was going to say that's there. I mean, I feel like, honestly, even going back to the sleep books, but I was thinking just in terms of to stay with the horror stuff, there were always these, adults, quote unquote, at least in terms of age, who are finding themselves in these situations where they're just like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? And it's like, oh, reality TV show about my daughter's exorcism. This seems like a great idea. Or I know this is kind of a shitty idea, but there's money, and by God, we need the money. We can't afford Stephen Graham Jones as a tutor for our daughter.
That's right. It's very expensive.
He costs a lot of money. Yeah. He costs, that handsomeness does not come cheap, my friends. And I think that what is the meme about, like someone calls out, like, is there an adult? And like I'm like looking around, like I'm like, well, I'm an adult, but I'm looking for an adultier adult. I'm like, where's mom or dad or Obama or whoever, Thanks, Obama.
I do get that feeling though when you listen to it, and I don't want to go political at all, but when you listen to an Obama interview or watch one, it's like, wow, he's an adult. Are there any other adults out there?
Right. Phone Obama quickly. Obama, what do I do?
Yeah. Hey, so also you were talking about, growing up in the 80s, the protagonist was, and I sometimes I wonder, what is it about the 80s that we're also nostalgic about? I think that's rhetorical, because there's a lot about the 80s that was it as good as we remember it being? If you're, say, an average kid, like, looks like you had pretty much average childhood, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's human nature, to look back at the time you were a kid. Like I've also been super wary or leery or whatever is the correct usage of the word here. Like I don't want it to be nostalgia necessarily, like looking back and thinking this was great. Like, no, I wanted to,
Well,
these are
no, the kid
stories
is miserable.
right, happens to be set in this time. Same with the Pallbearers Club. But right, it's not great. There are these problems, and it's just, yeah. I mean, I like to think of those stories hopefully as like anti-nostalgia stories, like Stranger Things is a lot of fun and all, but I don't want the 80s to feel like that, like just the set of pop culture reference and everyone's having a great time riding bikes, until someone disappears into the nether or the upside down world or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think like, you think like enough time has passed that maybe you have a little bit more perspective on when it happened, and it's a little bit safer to explore it in greater detail. Especially when the present can seem so confusing because you're in it when it's happening. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, clearly many another author has gone back to their childhood to set stories there, etc.
You have
But John and Laird, I don't think you guys have done it very often.
What's
No.
that?
Gone back to written a story set in the 80s or
I'm trying to think. Laird, what
Yeah.
about?
Like half the Cronings in the 80s.
Okay.
But from the
Laird and
point
I,
of view-
though, didn't really have that 80s childhood.
Well, right. And I look at, I've set a lot of stories, or more and more stories, in the 70s and stuff, but mostly because it's dark. I talked about how the 70s is sort of like the dark ages of suburbia,
Yeah.
spreading across the United States, like a wilderness. But I'm nostalgic about certain aspects of the 80s, but I'm with you. I don't really share I understand why people are. The music, the technology was rapidly advancing. I mean, computers were entering the picture. I mean, it was very, exciting time. But I look at it with a lot of antipathy myself. So I'm with you with the whole anti-nostalgia, because for me it was just not just because of my situation, but because, I mean, serial killer trading cards, and when we had named all our serial killers, and AIDS epidemic. Were we going to get bombed into oblivion by Russia? I mean, I lived in Alaska in a real fear. I mean, we didn't have a bunker or something, but we lived with real fear that there was going to be, some kind of conflict, and we'd be.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
we live close
my son
enough
was
to
talking recently.
Elmendorf.
I'm living in the worst time. There's so many of these horrible things that can happen. I like, Logan, try growing up in the 80s. We felt like we were going to get bombed any minute. So yeah, there's a lot of anti-nostalgia too.
No, so I'm certainly not trying to propose that the 80s were some dire period. I'm more with you, Paul, but for more reasons than simply because I didn't get much of a childhood. It was more I was quite cognizant of the political and social, with the AIDS epidemic, and that actually did a lot to bring out the inequity, to highlight the inequity of how the status quo population treats marginalized people, and which was very much at odds with how I was being raised. Like, everything's great, here, wrap yourself in this flag, keep warm. You know, the bottom line is I see more your kind of, and I like the way that you do it. You don't, it's not like you're banging the drum or something. You're just, no, it's more visceral, more raw, more great. You know, it's just like more how it was, really.
Paul, you have two stories, I believe, in this collection that are in the same, what I want to say, world universe as A Head Full of Ghosts.
Mm.
You want to talk about those? I have to tell you that Possessed by the Possession was another story that, especially the last 3 pages, I thought it is some of the creepiest shit I have ever read. No,
Yeah, well, thank you.
No kidding. It's very, very scary. I mean, I'm literally sitting here thinking I can't wait till July 11th gets here and for more readers to experience this, because it's very scary stuff.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. So as far as like connections to A Head Full of Ghosts, like I'd probably never say never. If there becomes like a financial component where we're going to lose the house, like sure, maybe I would write a sequel to the novel Head Full of Ghosts. But I always thought it'd be fun to, because the two sisters, Mary and Marjorie, part of their relationship in the novels that they tell each other stories. So I thought it'd be fun, to continue to occasionally write a short story that Marjorie was telling Mary, kind of thing. So, there's one very short, almost flash piece called Red Eyes that Marjorie is telling her sister about a giant monster invasion. But the story you're referring to, Possessed by the Possession, was written for Fangoria magazine. That was sort of cool. They asked me to write a short story for an issue. I was really excited, had no idea what to do. I took my dog for a walk and I was like, oh, like when I came back, I said, hey, can I write this as like a fake, editor?
And now all you writers out there,
like
you now know the secret to writing.
Yeah.
Take your dog for a walk.
Yeah. Because the blogger in A Head Full of Ghosts, at the end says she got hired by Fangoria. So I'm like, okay, Karen Brissett is working for Fangoria now, and she's answering letters to people who had read her sort of breakdown of the Blu-ray release of The Possession. So there's that connection to it. But if you haven't read A Head Full of Ghosts, it's fine. There's clearly enough. Like you don't need to have read it to read that story and sort of get what's going on, because she's,
well, it's a very novel meta idea.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I don't know. And again, I think actually there's definitely those last 3 pages of that story is sort of like a very clear connection, in retrospect now to, the first story, the idea of like the types of things that you would think like when you're home alone, or even if you're not home alone, you just happen to be the only one awake or something like that.
The third scenario is like that. Yeah, you're in the middle of the night and you're lying next to your spouse,
right. Yeah, well, thank you. I'm glad that worked. I mean, my hope
really
was like that the first part of the story feels sort of jokey and fun, and then hopefully turns sinister and creepy by the end.
It definitely takes you by surprise. No matter what collection you're reading, there are always stories that these really click with me, and I like these, but the other ones click with me more. And
sure.
Yeah, I felt that the personal stories in this collection just were creepier to me. But I enjoyed the entire collection.
Thank you.
The other one that made me feel that way was I Know You're There.
Yeah, it's a more recent one.
Yeah. I saw in your notes that you said this is about the pandemic, obviously, or words to that effect. And I shook my head at the obviously because, well, I thought, well, Mike, you missed it. If that's what it was, I just sort of looked at it as this man lost his partner.
Right.
But what happens or possibly happens is very scary. I can't, really, again, spoilers. I'd ruin the story if I said much about it. Speaking of that ambiguity, schmiggity. I like the way that you made light of yourself in the Possession story, in the Fangoria story about that.
Oh yeah.
Can't Tremblay just make up his mind which way it is? Anyway, I'll turn it back over to you guys. But I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed those.
Well, thank you. I mean, really quickly, as far as that one being like a pandemic story, I don't necessarily, I probably should explain myself better in the story notes. But what it's more is like, for me, it was like a pandemic informed story, like just in terms of like this story about grief, and how the surviving partner, because that's not a spoiler, it happens early on that,
Right.
this man's husband, dies. And that husband, the partner who died, was working at home. So, I mean, there's clearly pandemic things happening without it being, spelled out. I don't know. To me, that story is just about sort of the grief and the collective grief that we all have to deal with, based on what we went through and continue to go through.
Paul, Laird, you guys have anything?
No,
I keep talking too.
No, I mean, nothing specific. I mean, you can't really say too much without spoiling things, but I just think this is, you can see this evolution in Paul's writing over the years. And I think it's, it's to be expected. Of course, you write long enough, hopefully you're going to make some changes, but I just, become kind of a new animal as time goes on. But
New beast.
A new beast. But no, I do have a comment. I meant to say something early on. It was sort of not really hugely relevant, but I really love the cover.
Yeah.
I thought you never know, right? With commercial novels, it could just be serviceable, but this is a really great cover, like something you'd expect from a specialty press. I really like it.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, I definitely got lucky. It's funny. Actually, if Cisco was here, like he had, Cisco on Twitter, I don't know if he still does, or he used to always he'd frequently post like artist images and just say, hey, here's this artist, etc.
He still does that.
Yeah, and he posted this one painting by I think an Eastern European artist whose name I'm forgetting, but it's just this visceral black and white dog being attacked by a warthog, and the look on the dog's face, the anger, but also just the fear. In some ways, it reminds me of that Ivan the Terrible sort of painting, which the title of which I'm forgetting, where Ivan's hugging like his dead son, and there's just a look on his face. But anyway, but it's a look on the dog's face, and I wanted to use that for the cover. So like, I'm not a cover designer, but William Morrow usually asks me for ideas, and most of the time, I'm like, I have no idea. I'll comment, what you send after. But I actually submitted the collection with that painting embedded to my editor. So I said, if we can get this, I would really like it. And so they started working on that, but they could not get the rights to it. I think the artist is deceased, and whoever runs that artist's Instagram wasn't responding. I don't know if it's like a relative or something. So it was like, I want sort of something like that. And, so this is actually quite different just in terms of the color scheme and everything else, but definitely sort of fun in spirit. The other weird part is that the person who designed it, Brian Moore, went to college with my brother. So I know Brian. I had no idea that he was doing cover design.
Well, how hard was it for you to get the rights to the art in the first story? Was that pretty difficult?
Yeah,
talk about that.
I just bought her like a soda. Yeah, I know. So poor Emma. I've mined her. I mind everybody in the house.
Yeah, I'm gonna show that to the audience real quick.
Yeah, she's actually kind of mad now because she probably drew that when she was like 11 or 12.
Oh, is she?
Like, oh, that's terrible. Yeah. But, I mean, the whole idea was like, this is a young artist, drawing things. So for like being
it's a very creepy drawing.
It is a creepy drawing. It's actually even creepier in real life because she said she used to dream about that creature in her dreams every night, and her dreams always ended with her death. And I was like, oh, Emma, it's so upsetting, and support her, but like, hey, can I use that for a story?
Let me exploit this.
Right.
Thanks, kid.
Yeah.
You're looking at the cover of his next novel.
You got any more?
Tell me about your other nightmares.
Tell me about your other trauma.
Yeah, she'll have her revenge. She'll tattoo it on me in my sleep or something, because now she's got a tattoo gun.
I feel like something's following me.
There's something though. I just want to go back to the 80s thing, because that's just kind of like percolating, because like in some ways
it's on my mind because an author just sent me this. I love the 80s by B. Harrison Smith, and look how thick this thing is.
Yeah, not necessarily I survived, but I lived.
Yeah, he's got all kinds of pictures inside too. So it's going to take me forever to get through it, but it's interesting.
I was just thinking about because I know Laird and I have talked about him going back to the 70s and really interested in sort of '70s culture and '70s kind of horror culture, and you know,
Oh yeah.
in Swift to Chase, you know, like one of the things he was doing was actually kind of mining slasher uh lore or slasher structures. And I was thinking about like yeah, I haven't written anything that I can really think of set in the '80s, maybe nothing major. And anyway, you know, and so I was thinking about how like that was for me. Yeah, this incredibly formative experience. That's when I discover Stephen King. That's when I read Peter Straub. That's when I read Ted Klein. That's when I start writing my own stuff, you know. And I'm like, man, like I in some ways, right, I do feel there's a kind of like resurgence of '80s style horror in that you have more kind of big books, and they're more like, here's a suburban environment and a monster intrudes or something like that. And I'm not trying to be like condescending or whatever, but just it's like I feel like there's been like almost like a kind of a structural resurgence of the '80s, and how we all grew up on Stephen King, right? That's when Stephen King really explodes. I mean, he's big in the '70s, obviously, but the '80s is really the decade where he just comes into his own as this kind of powerhouse, right? So that what's interesting to me is and there are, let me just take that a little bit further. There are these books in the '80s like The Body, King, or Shadowland, Straub, or McCammon's A Boy's Life. And I'm sure there were Dan Simmons, Summer of Night. There are these books that are all novels of childhood, but they're all childhood in like the '50s or the '60s or something like that, you know. And it is kind of true now that I think about it. I'm like, I know like Stranger Things is what we have now. Stranger Things is like childhood in the '80s, but it's really not, right? I mean, and no, I love Stranger Things. I'm not trying to knock it, but I'm just thinking about, you know, the what King does in The Body, say, you know, the places he goes to there. I don't know off the top of my head, you know, is there a novel yet that someone of our generation has written that goes there? And yeah, it was a terrifying time, right? I mean, you know, the AIDS crisis, constant threat of nuclear annihilation, movies like The Day After, or what was the other one? Special Report. That was the
it was Testament that was horrifying.
Yeah, Testament too. No, remember the one that it was supposed to be like a special report, and it was an Orson Welles type thing, right? You
and
know,
in the end, they detonated. Yeah,
right, exactly. Yeah. And
oh yeah, we were all that was on everybody's mind.
Yeah, and
well,
even
like the movie War Games was on like HBO all the time.
Yeah.
Watch that anyway.
Not to worry though, because if you get nuked, just go underneath your desk. That'll protect you.
Yeah. And I think about those. I thought about, I just have thought about that with certain politicians talking about how great it was when you grew up. Wasn't it nice? And I'm like, no. It was, I mean, there were great things. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't all horror and misery, but geez, man, there was a lot of horrifying kind of stress.
Serial, like I said, serial killer trading cards. I mean, serial killing was in the news. Ubiquitous. It was ubiquitous. Yeah. And you know something, the whole specter of gun violence, it was prominent in the '80s as well. There were, I mean, I don't think a night went by that, whether it was local or national news, they weren't reporting a mass shooting in a McDonald's or a grocery store. I mean, less schools back then.
Right.
But the point is we've been haunted by that.
Yeah, that's when like even the phrase "going postal" got created, because
that's
right. Of shootings at post offices. Yeah.
And then there was one other thing we haven't touched on. You know, I'm more just commenting. It's not really, you know, trying to have an opinion about this stuff, but just to toss it out there and go, you know, it wasn't all. I'm kind of surprised we're so rosy lensed about it. The terror, you know, like international terror, Ireland, you know, the times of troubles, right? I mean, the bombings over the Middle East, the barracks, the bombing. I mean,
in Lebanon,
all around the world was supposed, but especially in Central America or Central America and in the Mideast. Americans being shot and Brits being shot at coffee shops. Like, you didn't want to be sitting within 20 feet of somebody, from there, because when the gunman came by, they might get you. The bottom line is, it was every night. This was just, so I think it's pretty easy to go, oh, we live in a really bad time, but then you start and look at the past as if it's wonderful. That's why whenever these politicians talk about they want to go back to the 50s, I'm like, oh, really? Let's take stock of that.
Yeah.
How horrible it was for everybody but you, probably.
Right.
So yeah, like I said, I don't begrudge the nostalgia element for whatever era. I mean, if that's your bag, that's your bag. There's wonderful things, but particularly the 80s, because I did, grow up in it. It was harrowing for a lot of reasons.
And the more it's funny, because like now we're talking about it, I'm like, oh, and remember the time that we sent all the troops to Honduras? Like, it was and it looked like we were going to invade Nicaragua, and it was like this whole, like, oh my god, like, and here's Vietnam. Like, that was the thing too, is that in the 80s, with films like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket, like Vietnam was being explored, or I don't know how to put it, like addressed in film and in ways that it maybe hadn't been, except for things like Apocalypse Now, maybe, and Coming Home. So I think that
we've had about 10 or 11 years
to kind of start to process it, right? And so it's kind of funny to think about, actually. I mean, now I'm like, oh man,
I agree with everything.
There is a novel in this,
Yeah. Well, especially, I'll throw up a counterpoint. It could be used in the novel. First of all, I agree with everything you guys are saying about all of this. And then, but I think of my wife, who grew up in a small town in Illinois, Ray Bradbury type of town, and very insulated, obviously no social media, anything like that, not really particularly paying attention to the news. Teachers that she had in the high school, she's the youngest of 6 kids, taught her older brothers. There was no the principal's the principal for a year or two, and then he moves on to Chicago. It's a time that she looks back at with a hell of a lot of nostalgia. And a lot of that is she grew up in Mayberry. She didn't grow up on the south side of Chicago or anything like that. But I think both are valid depending on your experience. So there's a lot to mine there, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, I mean, all nostalgia sort of rooted in, well, I shouldn't say all, but I think for a lot of people, I mean, you're looking back on a time where you did not have the adult responsibilities that you have now. So even if, there were fairly horrible things happening in your family going on, I mean, there's sort of that glow of like, oh, I didn't have to, I didn't have to work this crappy job, or I didn't have to, have all these other pressures on me. And the afterglow of memories, it always seems better. I mean, it happens with the stories and books that we write. Like, oh, that book was so much easier to write than this one. What the hell? It's just how sort of memory works.
Family probably has a lot to do with it too. If you had a great family and you felt safe growing up in your family unit, that's different from a lot of other people's experience. Maybe their parents split and whatever. So yeah, there's definitely a lot to mine there. The Beast You Are, you want to talk about that story?
Yes, I'm only writing in free verse for the rest of my life. John's like, oh my God, no.
Well, no, Kelly Link was like, didn't she give you a very nice blurb about how she wanted so much more of this now. So thanks a lot, Paul. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. You mean thanks a lot, Kelly?
Yeah.
She's encouraging him.
Exactly. She's encouraging him. And now my agent's going to be like, what do you got in the free verse department?
Tremblay did it.
Yeah. So I would say briefly, like, I typically don't have like a bullpen of ideas waiting for me. And I know John and Laird do, which is great. Or, I mean, you think like you've got this pool. For me, I typically go from novel to novel. Like, I don't have, I have these 4 things I want to write, which is also both exciting and scary, because like, okay. And, the trust is hopefully I'll come up with the next book idea, because I don't have one waiting around. But anyway, this anthropomorphic animal story is something that I've wanted to write for a while. I didn't have the whole story in mind, but I knew there was going to be like this cult, a giant monster that visits every 30 years. I had like a lot of the bones in place in my head, and for me, again, like I'd said earlier, that most, if not all my stuff starts from like a place of a fan. I love Watership Down. I was such a scaredy cat as a kid, and that movie should have scared me, but it didn't. I just remember being endlessly fascinated, and even the violent aspect of it, like gore and stuff like that used to really bother me as a kid. But for some reason, in the movie, the film, the 70s cartoon version of it, I don't know, it was just, I could have, and I probably did watch that, just over and over again. It felt like that was the first time, because I saw it when I was fairly young, like 9 or 10, I guess. It felt like I was maybe for the first time seeing like an adult thing, even though it was cartoon rabbits, right? And there was some sort of wisdom to be gained from it, even if I couldn't articulate it. So anyway, this long time love for Watership Down, even stuff like Secrets of Nim, and
I was about to mention
yeah.
that. I love that movie.
And obviously when I was a little older, Animal Farm, and the free verse aspect was definitely sort of inspired by Beowulf, but probably more Toby Barlow's Sharp Teeth, which is a very fun LA werewolf novel told in free verse. So all of that, I was like, oh, I want to try that someday. But I knew that my publisher would never let me. My publisher.
I would say.
What was that?
Nothing.
Nothing. Only the wind, Paul. Only the
Only
wind.
the wind. Is that my sign? Like the Oscars, I'm supposed to stop talking.
The music's coming on.
Yeah. So the last thing I would say is that I knew my publisher would never let me get away with writing a novel version of this. So I was like, how can I do this? When we pitched the Pallbearers Club, I figured they were going to offer for the Pallbearers Club maybe another novel. And they said, hey, we want another collection from you too. And I never pitched that. I was like, oh, I don't know how many stories I have, but I was like,
Yeah.
I can write, I'll write the story as a novella. That'll be perfect. Like this big original thing and I never told my editor that I was doing that, which I highly recommend.
Another writing tip, folks.
Yeah, and it's much better. I'm glad it's in the format it is. Like it's much better off at this 30,000 word count than like a bigger novel version of it, I think. But I will say, to the point where I did turn it into my editor, she was happy with the book. But in terms of edits, there weren't that many because most of the stories were already previously published. And she just said to me about the novellas, like, I don't even know like what I could say. So I'm not, she's like, I don't even know what to do with this, was I think her direct quote.
That reminds me of when
Yeah.
Joe Pulver would tell me to edit his stuff. I'm like, no, no.
Nice. I will say, luckily, the copy editor who was assigned was someone who had like a degree in like folklore and stuff. So her copy edits were great. Actually, a lot of her comments were very helpful.
Hey, listen, before we go, you mentioned Cormac McCarthy briefly earlier, and I actually had wanted to bring him up. He recently passed. Anything you guys want to say? I just want to say that the last two books, The Passenger and Stella Maris, were like this very unexpected gift. I didn't know that we were going to get anything else from Cormac McCarthy. So it's been a while. So, yeah.
I don't have much to. It's funny because I just don't have much to say about him at this point. It's kind of too big for me to grapple with. You obviously never met him or anything like that, but he's had a very profound impact on my writing. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm mourning. I've expected it for many years, and he lived to a ripe old age, and I'm glad that he was able to have a lot of success when he had to wait until he was, about 60, but he finally had commercial success and was able to get, into a better life situation and to extend his life. I can tell you from personal experience, being a poor author can be deleterious to your chances of living a long life. So I'm glad for that. I'm glad that he had that commercial success to go with the critical acclaim and cult acclaim that he had already garnered. And I'll miss him.
It's also a lesson on not ever giving up on whatever dream it is that you're chasing, no matter what age you are.
That's right.
Which may sound cliche and trite, but it's also very, very true.
John should give up, though.
I have.
No,
I have. In here, I'm dead.
Yeah, I would say just really like I think I read Cormac because of Laird, because I didn't grow up reading him. And once I, became friendly with Laird, knew how much of an important writer he was for him. That's why I read Blood Meridian and Child of God. So I mean, just obviously a genius writer, the kind where like, I read and I'm like, usually like reading for me, like if I'm reading something I really enjoy, like it inspires me to want to try something like that. But he's certainly on the list of writers. When I read it, I'm like, oh, I could never do this, but I'm enjoying it quite immensely.
Mm.
Yeah, there was something I kind of feel like the highest praise I can give any writer is to say that, they have tremendous ambition and the talent to make good on that ambition. And I don't know how McCarthy felt about his own work, if he felt that he'd succeeded or not, but yeah, there's just like the fact that this guy was just like, I'm just leaving it all on the page, I'm just going full bore. And it's like it's a particular kind of very American kind of writing in some ways. There's Faulkner in the background and that sort of stuff. But there's actually it's abridged, but Brad Pitt did a reading of the Border trilogy, which is I listened to in my car a few years ago. And as I said, it's abridged. It's so, take that for what it's worth. But it's still, Brad Pitt does a pretty good job at getting the voice, and it's a nice thing to have. I'm glad, like I have it. I got it at a used
I'll check it
sale.
out.
Yeah,
I am
it's-
conflicted though, because there's evil and then there's people who abridge books.
I know,
know.
I know. But it was a good, and I think the thing is too that like so much of his stuff, I feel like All the Pretty Horses, like when I read that, I was like, oh, this isn't Blood Meridian. And lately after he died, I was like, so what? Like it's no, it's not Blood Meridian. It's more like his take on like maybe Huck Finn, or it's like a Twain kind of story. There is some real serious violent stuff in it, but there's also, he was a very funny writer. There's some really, really hysterically funny things, and yeah, we they say we shall not see his like again, and I think that's probably true.
Well, Paul's book is called The Beast You Are.
And you'll see his like again. So
I was
many
going to say, you'll see
times.
Paul
See
all
his
over
like
the place.
again.
Yeah, you're going to see a lot of his like.
And it comes out on July the 11th, but you can go ahead and go to Amazon or the publisher's website. Who's the publisher again? I'm sorry.
William Morrow,
Right.
which is an imprint of HarperCollins.
So, don't underestimate, speaking to the audience, don't underestimate how important it is to pre-order a book for the author
So
and for the
important.
publisher.
It is.
Yeah, it is. If you know you're going to purchase this book and read it, go ahead and go over and pre-order it. If you pre-order the Kindle, you're going to get it right on July 11th. And I'm not sure how print works with Amazon, but I think it's like either the day or the day after. Obviously the Audible version as well. So do that. And hey, do yourself a favor, listen to this in the dark. You're going to be properly creeped out. So
Listen to this podcast in the dark.
I know that
This
I'm
podcast
already
in the dark?
creeped out. Yeah,
yeah,
that's going to be the new name for Mike's podcast. This podcast in the dark.
have one guy write me and tell me how much he enjoyed the podcast because he listens to it at night, and I've got a real soothing voice and it puts him to sleep. Like, thanks. I think. So anyway, Paul, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. Please, anytime. I'm honored, and it's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, John. Really good to see you. Laird, really good to see you. I know you're tired, so I'm gonna close this. But I know it's a long road, but you're looking better, and I'm really glad to see that.
I was happy to be on with you guys. I'm real happy Paul's got a new collection out and everything's going great. It's just good to see you.
I'll have the link to the book
same.
in the show notes, guys. So head on over and pre-order it. Guys, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next week.